Let's get a word from Emilio Casalicchio, who's the editor of Politico's London Playbook PM. Afternoon to you, Emilio. Good to have you with us. There is certainly a divide. I think we can all agree on that. There's no doubt Mr. Trump does somewhat divide opinion, divide the room, and if you live your life by social media, divide people's minds as well.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's understandable that he incites strong reactions. You know, he is a disruptor in the world, and as president, he's a disruptor leading the biggest, most powerful nation in the world. So it's quite a big deal. He has obviously a very idiosyncratic approach when it comes to the way that he talks and his language, but also, yeah, the things that he says that he will do, for example, on trade and on climate and on foreign policy, which, yeah, goes against the grain of the things that a lot of the rest of the kind of Western democratic world are saying. So in a way, yeah, it's a little surprised that he incites strong reactions, I think. Can I just mention one thing you said there about the US President Joe Biden hasn't said anything? He's congratulated Donald Trump, and he's also invited him for a visit to the White House.
Yeah, that's a private phone call though, isn't it?
Sure, but he said in public that he's congratulated Donald Trump. You know, they put out a statement, etc. So he has said something.
We haven't seen him though.
We've not seen him yet.
All right. No, that was rather my point, that, you know, by now, you know, the fella should have been out the White House, like, gone midnight, out there straight away saying, hey, we got a new president, fantastic. But that's, you know, I guess they have different ways. And maybe if I was Joe Biden, I would feel I owe Donald Trump absolutely nothing. So perhaps there was a little bit of that in there. In terms of, I mean, you're right, he goes off-piste, he sings from a very different hymn sheet. But, of course, one of the reasons, Emilio, people like him is for that very reason. And one of the biggest criticisms we seem to get, I sense, from a lot of our politicians, Conservative or Labour, is there is a feel, you know, when I heard Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's Question Time say it again, you know, we need to build on the foundations of it. It's like, oh my God, no, that cliche again. And I reckon if I went to France, I would hear Macron say the same thing. If I went to Germany, I'd hear Scholz say exactly the same thing. This sort of very clinical, almost sort of Westminster playbook, Parisian playbook, Berlin playbook, where politicians all have a certain language. It's a sort of a weird groupthink. And in the West, I think we've seen a lot of that. And I can see, you know, there are elements and areas where there would be obvious advantages to, you know, getting together with like-minded nations and coming to common agreements. But often the downside of that is that you get a feeling, people perhaps get a feeling that this person isn't speaking philosophically, they're speaking on behalf of something else.
Well, I think that is the way that maybe a lot of voters think. I think, yeah, it's not a huge surprise that voters are frustrated, yes, with that caution or with that classic politician avoidance of answering questions, being very careful with their wording, etc. And I think that the reason that politicians do that is obviously because they realise the weight and the power of their words. If they slightly speak out of turn, give the impression that they might think or be about to do something which could have massive ramifications for the markets or for foreign policy or for domestic policy and people's the money in people's pockets, etc. They realise that that's a big deal. And Donald Trump doesn't really have that switch, that kind of cautious switch. He'll just sort of say anything. And obviously, yeah, the voters love that because they're sick of hearing politicians, like you're saying, kind of almost read from a script. But obviously that comes with its kind of pros and cons, I think. And if everybody in the world, if all the Western leaders spoke like Donald Trump, then, you know, who knows? You can have one disruptor, but if everyone's a disruptor, maybe that would make life difficult. Who knows?
I was just thinking as you were saying that, I remember during the whole COVID time, do you remember that moment, I think it was in the White House, when Trump made reference to bleach being, to be fair, he never did say take bleach, drink bleach or inject bleach, but he was musing, as he does, that he'd heard somebody say there's this bleach thing that does a great number, you know, and that it was that kind of thing. And in the background there was a medical doctor who happened to be in the room. I think she literally had a cardiac arrest at this point, because he did exactly that thing, Emilio. He just went off script. You know, he'd heard an anecdote the day before and he retold it, forgetting that when the president of the free world, president of America and the leader of the free world tells an anecdote, it travels a little more urgently than the likes of you and me doing it. And so it's that lack of that sort of maybe that pause button, but perhaps the rest of the world is maybe too apprehensive, because we see leaders speak and we don't know whether we, you know, most of the time when Trump speaks, you think, well, I might disagree with him, but at least he believes that. He's got a vision. He's got an energy behind that vision.
Absolutely. And I think, though, often the politicians that do really well are the politicians that are able to remain on script and, yeah, be cautious in the language and know that they're not going to say something that, yeah, completely disrupts or spreads misinformation or puts people at risk or changes the markets. However, do it in a way that makes it sound like they're talking very freely. You know, people like Tony Blair's very famous for this. Bill Clinton's very famous for this. Wes Streeting's very famous for this. These people who, okay, those are all examples on the left, but people who can talk, sound like normal people with passion and also have the caution. I think the thing that frustrates voters is when you get politicians that can't really do that. So they stick to the script, but they really, really, really sound like they're sticking to the script. And so when they answer questions, you can tell they're not answering, and it's very frustrating because they're just talking in jargon and you can't understand that. Donald Trump comes at it from a slightly different perspective. He literally kind of does say whatever pops into his mind. He doesn't have that cautious switch, and you know, people respond to that. Like we say, people like people that sound authentic. And Nigel Farage is a great example.
Exactly. Yeah, you think, well, actually, that's how the bloke speaks, and that's, you know, what he believes. I might disagree, but you know, he's authentic, and it's that authenticity, I guess, that also sells. In terms of what Trump is likely to do, now, look, he's a lot of things. I know his business models over the years, you know, he's made a lot of money, he's employed a lot of people. Not everything has been a huge success. He's had some pretty grim times in his business CV. But broadly speaking, he's built an empire, no doubt about it. I think he claimed he built 9/10 of New York. That was not true, but he did say it very convincingly. I nearly believed him for a second. But nonetheless, he's a guy that has done well in business. Now, he's not stupid, is my point here, and I can't imagine, whether it's climate or whether it's trade, that even by the sort of vaguely impenetrable nature of a mind like Donald Trump's, and I'd imagine those around him find it hard to get through sometimes because he's so set in his ways. But in a quiet moment, he's going to go away, surely, with his advisors, the ones he trusts, and they're going to say, look, we're not going to do anything here, clearly, that's going to, collapse the global economy. That would be ridiculous, because we are all, to a lesser or a greater extent, interdependent on each other in varying ways. So the point is, he's not going to go utterly nuts, is he? He's not, I know the left like to say he's a dictator, but he's a businessman, first and foremost. He has got some common sense in that area.
Well, I think the key question there is what will collapse the global economy. Yeah. This is the point, right? He's a disruptor, so he will say and plan potentially to do things that others might argue would be very risky and could have major consequences for global markets. But his point is that that's wrong, and that actually we need to change course on some of this stuff, and we might get results that the established way of thinking can't envisage. So, for example, what he's saying about tariffs and China putting huge tariffs on other countries, most people would say, well, that's a big risk because we're going to disrupt the markets. We're so reliant on China for so many of our cheap goods. And if you put that at risk, then, that's going to change people's lives on the ground. Whereas Trump says, well, no, we need to have a bigger argument about this. China is disrupting global markets itself. It has the economic power to push and pull the global economy, and we need to fight back harder against that for a kind of greater purpose. And some of the big risks that people are talking about actually won't come to pass. So there is a debate, really, in some respects, on some topics about what the big consequences are. Climate, again, is another issue, right? Yeah. Some people will say that what Trump is saying that he would do about drilling for more oil and fossil fuel policies is terrible for the climate. Trump would say it's probably not as bad as people like to claim that it's going to be, and it's very important that we make sure that we are self-sufficient domestically and that our fuel is cheaper as well. So it's a matter of perspective. What is a massive global risk? What is a nuts thing to do, right? Like you're saying, and Trump and other people in other democracies around the world maybe have different views on that.
Indeed, we will see. But I think the president of China might curiously find himself in agreement with quite a lot of what Trump is thinking. Interesting times. Emilio, thank you for your time, sir. Emilio Casalicchio, who is the editor of Politico's London Playbook PM. Thank you to him.